Hi everyone. So in today's video, we are going to have a close detailed look at the assembly process of a plastic model kit of the Going Merry ship from the One Piece anime. While this Bandai kit also includes the crew members from the early seasons of the One Piece anime, those miniature figures will be showcased only at a much later video. Instead, what we have here are various parts and sub-assemblies that I had painted or panel-lined with either acrylic or enamel paints. In addition to that, I have also applied water decals on the relevant sections of this ship in order to enhance the realistic details of the kit. And because there is so much ground for us to cover, I have provided some timestamps in the description below so that you can go straight to the relevant sections of the assembly process that you wish to view. As I mentioned earlier, there are lots for us to cover, so without further ado, let's get started on the assembly process of the Going Merry ship. We'll begin the assembly for the Going Merry ship with steps 1 and 2 of the guide. Now this will involve assembling the central deck of the ship, and the central deck here comprises some stairs, some doorways and windows, walls that surround that central deck in the middle there. So now what I've done to the central deck is to paint it using enamel paint in order to showcase the wood grain that has been molded into the plastic. Meanwhile, for the doors and the windows, I had also painted them using some Vallejo model color acrylic paints. Here I used some metallic paints, some brown paints, as well as some light blue paints. Now, these parts here you see are some stairways that link into the central deck, which also contain a small door. Meanwhile, here are the railings that accompany those said staircase. So, with the parts now fully laid out, let's get started on the assembly of the Going Merry ship. First up, I will place the small staircases leading onto the central deck. For now, I ask that you ignore that big round hole in the middle of the central deck, because that is where I'm going to place the main mast of the ship at a much later stage. So here now the staircases have been attached onto the central deck. Now we'll move on to the side walls that surround the central deck. As I mentioned earlier, the windows and doorways here I have painted using acrylic paint. What Bandai provided with this kit was some colored stickers to ensure color accuracy for the kit, but I decided to paint the doors and windows in order to make them look more realistic. Attaching the second side wall now. It's a very simple connection. Square packed into a square hole. So that's the central deck, minus the railings, which I will place onto the staircases now. For the staircases, all I did was just to panel line them using grey enamel paint. So the whites that you see are the original plastic mold colors. My advice is to be very careful when you are attaching the railings onto the ship, because they look very fragile and have a possibility of snapping in two if you are not too careful. So that's the first railing onto the side of the staircase. I really love the way that Bandai has molded the wood grain onto the central deck. Just with a little bit of painting, the wood grain becomes more visible and it looks very realistic in the sense that it looks like real wooden planks on the central deck. That's the second railing onto the staircase. I'm just making sure that it fits on tightly because there's a gap, and once you can see a gap, that means that it's not fixed on properly. It's already on properly now. So that's the central deck of the Going Merry ship. The central deck provides a basis from which all the other parts will attach onto. So let's now move on to the next steps. Laid out here on the work mat are some of the parts and sub-assemblies which I will be attaching onto the central deck of the Going Merry ship. Some of them I have fully painted, while some I have just panel lined and retained the original plastic mold colors. Let's now get started on the next steps, which actually involves steps 3 and 4. In this, there are a lot of stickers that were used, but for my case, instead of using the stickers, I actually painted the parts. Then we will move on to steps 5 through 8, in which the rest of the ship's hull will be attached onto the central deck and the two halves of the ship that you saw earlier, before finishing with the anchor and the rear of the ship, which is step 9. We are going to be attempting the assembly process from steps 3 through steps 9 in this section of the video. Now, before I begin putting these parts together, let me just go through with you what I have done to the individual parts and sub-assemblies. Now, for the cannon you see here, the original plastic mold color is a very nice, shiny, dark metallic color. So all I did was to panel line the cannons, and that seemed enough to make the cannons look rather realistic. Now, for the side of the ship's hull, I have fully painted it. The whites that you see and the wooden planks around the ship, as well as the metallic parts surrounding the side of the hull, all this I had painted using lacquer paint via some airbrushing. For the ship's hull, I have also did some panel lining in order to bring out the details. For example, the wood grain that you see on the bottom of the ship's hull here, in addition to painting them, I've also used some enamel paints to panel line and bring out the details of the wood grain. This here is the rudder of the Going Merry ship, also fully painted, using a dark brown mixture as well as a metallic silver color. Now, this is the rear of the ship, which has two different shades of brown as well as the white that you see surrounding it. With that, let's start putting together the ship from steps 3 through 9. We will begin by putting the main front cannon of the ship onto the right half of the ship's hull, thus securing it onto the front half of the ship before we can proceed to the other steps of the assembly process. Next up, I will be attaching the central deck to the same half of the ship first. This will anchor the central deck at least onto one part of the hull, like what you see here, just ensuring that it clicks on as securely as I can make it. Before I go on to close up the central deck with the other half of the hull, I will first place the side cannons onto that right half of the ship. Most of the cannon will be enclosed within that small square hole, so just the barrel of the cannon will be visible. Next, I will close up the central deck with the other half of the ship. Securing not only the central deck in place, but also the front cannon of the Going Merry ship. The whites that you see on the side of the ship's hull were painted, as opposed to the white railings that you see on the central deck. This is because the white sections on the hull were originally molded in brown. So I had to prime it, then paint it in white. The alternative was to use the sticker decals that were provided by Bandai, but I believe that would have made it look really toy-like and very unappealing aesthetically. Hence, I proceeded to paint the white sections instead of using the sticker decals. Here the fitting is just not quite right, so I'm just trying to ensure that I've gotten the connections aligned properly so that both halves of the ship can close up without too much of a gap showing. So just making sure that I have everything aligned properly. Next will be the left side cannon, which attaches the same way as the right one. And as I mentioned earlier, all you can see is actually the front end of the barrel of the side cannon. Next up, I'll close up the bottom half of the ship. Now the bottom of the ship's hull was fully painted. The wooden parts were painted first in a wood brown color before being panelined in a darker shade of brown in order to bring out the wood grain details that are inherent in the ship's bottom hull, while the long white stripe running across the spine of the ship's bottom hull I had painted using a white acrylic paint, similar to the white sections that you see on both halves of the ship's hull. Now, with the bottom hull and the side hull attached to the central deck, go on to attach the rudder onto the rear hull before attaching that in turn onto the rest of the ship. Now the rudder has been painted in a much darker shade of brown, and this is actually in line with the color scheme that can be seen on the Going Merry ship in the anime series. So the rudder has been attached. Next will be a simple case of putting the rear section of the ship's hull onto the rest of the ship. Doing so will complete the assembly process, at least for the ship's hull. There's still a lot to go. For example, the rest of the deck, the mast of the ship, the sails, the rigging, all that will be in the later steps that I will show you further on in this video. So that then is the ship's hull complete. But these sections that you see here, I fear that I may have forgotten to paint it white, that small square sections there. But for now, I'm going to leave it as is, as I'll just concentrate on the assembly of the ship itself. Looking at it now, I'm very glad that I painted the parts, because the alternative would have been a plasticky looking kit. Now that's the slight rudder movement that's allowed. Anyway, with the ship's hull now fully assembled, let's now assemble the base so that the ship has something to rest on while the rest of the assembly process goes on. Building the ship's base at this point in time makes sense because the ship will need something to rest on while the rest of the assembly process is ongoing, because the rounded shape of the bottom of the hull means it cannot sit up securely without having a base. So the attachment of the anchor I'll be doing off camera, that's in step 9, while step 10 is the assembly of the base itself, which I'll be doing here. For the anchor that you see in my hand here, all I did was to panel line the shiny parts and paint the wooden parts in acrylic paint, while the rope remained in its original state. Meanwhile, the display base that you see here, I have painted using lacquer paint. Specifically, I use a gold color for the shiny bits on the display stand, while for the brown parts, I use a mahogany color from the Mr. Color lacquer paint line. So now, when attaching the stands onto the display base, there's actually only one way you can do it. The design of the pack and hold is such that it's almost impossible for you to attach the stands onto the base in the wrong way. Now, let me just move the ship's hull away so that I can use the table as an anchor for me to push the stands down onto the base so that the connection is secure, as you can see here. As I mentioned earlier, this display stand acts as a base upon which the ship's hull can rest. Because the rounded nature of the bottom of the hull means it cannot sit up straight in the way that the stand allows it to. So now I'll move on to attach the anchor onto the ship off camera. Then I'll come back and explain what I had done. So with the magic of video editing, we are back with the anchor completely fixed onto the ship. I had chosen to do it off camera because the process is quite complex and it would have taken me too long to record and it would have been a very boring process to watch. So what I did was to tie a knot on the insides of the ship, and I have glued on a square piece of sprue which I have cut off so that the knot doesn't come loose. Is that yellow piece with the Bandai logo. The anchor is attached to the end of the rope and it can be hooked on to the side of the hull like so, or just left hanging down straight, as you can see now. So that then is the anchor attached. We will now move on to the next steps of the assembly process for the Going Merry ship. Laid out on the work mat here is the assembly of the ship so far from steps 1 to 10, as well as some parts from the main deck as well as the railings, which I'm going to put onto the ship now. This is going to be steps 11 and 12, which will involve placing the ship onto the display stand first, which I've already done. Then before I put the rest of the deck onto the ship, I will first assemble the rear section of the deck, which comprises of 2 simple pieces. Then I'm going to put on the railing here. Oh shit. Shit. Sorry guys for all that cursing just now. So as you can see, I had snapped the railing in half. I had pushed down onto the deck too hard and snapped the railing into 2 pieces. So what I'm going to do now is to glue it back together using a special glue from Mr. Hobby. This is called Mr. Cement S. This is a very thin plastic glue which is in liquid form. It allows me to place the glue into very narrow gaps. Now what I can do with the glue here, as you can see, is to hold the 2 pieces together while slowly dabbing some of the glue onto the broken bits. Because the glue is in liquid form, through capillary action, it will slowly seep in between the broken pieces. So I'll just have to hold it steady while I'm doing this, and the glue will quickly melt the 2 broken pieces together. The results, as you can see, is pretty good, although admittedly the joints, the 2 separate parts have been weakened, but at least it's better than a broken railing. With the railing fixed, let's now continue with steps 11 and 12 of the assembly process, which is the attachment of the main deck and the railings onto the ship. With the railing now fixed using the Mr. Cement plastic glue, let's now proceed with the rest of the assembly process in steps 11 and 12. So what I'm going to do next is to attach the white railings that I'm holding in my hands now onto the central deck before attaching the front end of the deck onto the ship. There are some pegs on the back end of the wall which allows the railing to attach on, like so. The process is similar for the rear section of the ship. So that's all the railings now attached onto the central deck. I had better be careful or not I'll be snapping the railings in 2 again. once the railings are done, I'll now put on the front end of the deck onto the ship. And as I mentioned earlier, the wood grain molding on the deck is excellent, but it is not visible unless you paint it using enamel paints. Well, not exactly paint it, but sort of panel line it and wipe off the excess enamel paint so that the pattern of the wood grain becomes visible. This I had done off camera in order to shorten the length of the video that you're seeing now. So that's the front portion of the deck attached. All that's left for me to do in these two steps is to place the rear deck onto the ship. Now that short piece of railing, as you know, has been weakened by being snapped in two, so I'll have to be very careful not to break it again. Now I'm just making sure that the deck is attached on securely. With the railings and the deck of the ship attached onto the rest of the hull, steps 11 through 12 are now complete, and we can move on to the next part, which will be attaching a building onto the deck. Now, the building that I mentioned is actually just a small wooden shed that is located towards the rear section of the ship. And the assembly process for this small shed is going to be steps 13 and 14, as you can see here. The shed was molded in a darker brown color, which I had panel lined in a black or darker shade of brown in order to bring out the wooden grain details. I had also painted the windows and doors that you see on the shed. The assembly of the shed is done in 5 different parts, if I'm not mistaken, starting first with the 4 walls around that shed, which I'm attaching here. The fix or attachment is reasonably secure. And the pieces are designed in such a way that there's only one way that they can go in. That's the other side of the shed's wall. The blues in the round window panes I had painted using sky blue Vallejo model acrylic paint, while the golden metallic frames around the windows I painted using gold color. So now 3 sections of the shed's wall have been assembled. The rear wall actually has a tiny staircase which leads up to the roof. So now all that's left to do is the roof and the front wall, which has the door. So I'm attaching that now. It's a very simplistic build, but designed in such a way to be very, very secure so that it doesn't move around once everything has been put together. So the final piece will be the roof. Now that 3 rectangular holes that you see on top of the roof are holes onto which the trees will attach to later on. But for now, that small shed is now fully assembled and can be called complete. So that is steps 13 and 14 of the assembly process, which is just this small wooden shed on the main deck. With that done, let's move on to the next section of the assembly process. In this section of the assembly process, we are going to be putting together the main mast and sail of the Going Merry ship, as well as the crow's nest and the pirate flag that lies on top of the main mast. This will be done from steps 15, 16, and on to steps 17 and 18. So as you can see, I have put aside the ship's hull so that I can concentrate on the mast, the crow's nest, the sail, and the flag. So let's begin with the crow's nest. We'll start by attaching the ropes onto the crow's nest. These so-called ropes are actually plastic parts which I have painted in metallic color for the ends, as well as in a dark brown enamel paint color for the ropes itself. Attaching the ropes onto the crow's nest, like I'm doing here, isn't as straightforward as it seems, because again I'm doing this on camera, and because I'm doing it on camera, I'm actually putting the parts together at a kind of a weird angle. At the very least, it's different from the way I would assemble things if I was doing it off camera. Hence, anything that might seem to be a very simple cut and dry assembly process sometimes tend to take actually longer than they should, as is the case that's happening now in the simple act of attaching these 2 rope parts onto the Going Merry ship's crow nest. This crow's nest is actually original molded plastic color. All I did was just to panel line it with enamel paint to bring out the details. So now let's go on to assemble the main mast of the ship. The ropes that you see surrounding the mast I had painted using acrylic, or rather I have airbrushed using lacquer paint, whereas the wooden grain that you see on the mast I have brought out using the details I had brought out using enamel paint. with the main mast assembled, I'll go on to attach the rope parts onto the main mast. Doing so at this angle is really tough, so just bear with me while I try to put that small peg into the hole. I'm being extra careful because I do not want to snap that peg into half, because the plastic seems a bit brittle and fragile, and the last thing I want to do is to break it. That being said, I think I'm taking a tad too long to put this thing together, so let me just do this off camera so that I don't waste your time, and I'll come back when I've placed the rope onto the main mast. So I had gone ahead to attach the rope onto the top of the main mast of the ship. So what you see here is the attachment point of the rope onto the top end of the main mast. This I had done off camera because it was getting a bit too complicated to do it off camera at a weird angle, so it was much easier for me to fix everything off camera. So now let's see what's next for this part 15 of the assembly process. So it will involve attaching the crow's nest onto the top end of the mast via a simple peg and hole joint. Just a little bit of trivia while I'm fixing the crow's nest onto the top of the mast. The crow's nest on the ship is actually the place where a sailor would stand or sit on in order to be a lookout for the crew. So when that particular crew member is sitting or standing upon the crow's nest, he or she will be able to see out very far onto the horizon, giving him or her a very much wider and further point of view. So that's essentially what the crow's nest is for. Now I'm attaching the main flag, the main pirate flag, onto the top of the crow's nest. Now the straw hat pirate logo that you see on the black flag is actually a water decal. Same with the much larger logo that you see on the main sail. So both these are actually water decals, which I had applied onto the small flag and the main sail. Speaking of which, I will now attempt to fix or attach onto what I believe is called the yard, or the beam onto which the main sail is fixed. This yard, hopefully I have the terminology correct. If not, please do comment below and let me know if I had gotten it right or wrong. Now I'm going to attach the main sail onto this long beam. Now the sail is in its original state, meaning I did not paint or do anything to the sail apart from applying the water decal of that large pirate logo that you see. Next on the assembly process, will be to attach the mainsail onto the main mast of the ship, and that's what I'm going to be doing next. The attachment of the main mast onto the ship's mainsail will be first via a peg and hole joint of the section just below the crow's nest onto the midsection of the yard or the beam that is holding the mainsail. So now once the main mast is in place in relation to the mainsail, then I will have to move on to the ropes that are surrounding this sub-assembly. Now that long rope you see hanging on the front of the sail will be attached to the front of the ship, so that will be done later. So meanwhile, these two short ropes that are attached to the bottom of the crow's nest will be fixed to the yard or that beam holding the mainsail, which I'm actually struggling a bit to do, because I believe by painting the parts, meaning the ends of the ropes as well as that main beam that the rope is attached to, has caused some layers of paint to build up in between the connection points. But it's not that much more difficult. So anyway, I've still gotten it all done. So that is the main mast and the mainsail together with the pirate's flag and the crow's nest sub-assembly completed. Now we'll go on to attach the mast onto the ship in the next steps. Attaching the main mast and sail onto the central deck of the ship should be a straightforward process. First, let me bring the ship's hull into play, if you will. That round hole you see on the central deck on top of the ship's hull is where the main mast will go into. Just ensuring that the fit is tight and secure. As I mentioned earlier, that long rope that is hanging from the mainsail is to be attached onto the front section of the ship's hull. That main rope attached and secure, just pressing it down, making sure that I've gotten it into the connection point properly. So that's it. That's all there is to the assembly of the main mast, sail, the crow's nest and the pirate flag onto the central deck of the ship. Just let me zoom out with my camera so you can at least have a more overall view of the assembly that I have done so far. So just let me place the ship onto the base. This is the main mast and sails on, so we can now proceed to the next steps of the assembly process. We are moving on now to the secondary mast, sail and pirate flag, as well as the orange trees for the Going Merry ship. The assembly of these parts onto the ship will begin with step 19, which will involve the secondary mast and the secondary pirate flag, which is the smaller of the two flags. Then it will go on to steps 20 through 23, which will begin with the secondary sail and end with the orange trees. Now the law behind the orange trees I will explain in a much later part of this video. Let's begin this section of the assembly process by attaching the secondary pirate flag onto the secondary mast. There's a small attachment that needs to be fixed onto the flag first before it's attached to the rest of the secondary mast. As I mentioned earlier, the pirate logo that you see on the flags all have been done using water decals. There were stickers provided with the kit in relation to this flag pirate logos, but I decided to use the water decals, which in the end look much more realistic. So now I'm just attaching the rest of the secondary mast onto the flag. You have to be careful because there's only one way you can place the rest of the secondary mast onto the flag so that you have the orientation correct. So with the mast and the flag now fully assembled, I will go ahead to attach the ropes. These ropes have been painted using both acrylic and enamel paint. The enamel paint is largely on the ropes itself, while the ends, which you see like metallic parts, those I had painted with acrylic paints. So now I'm attaching the ropes, or in sailing terms, these are the rigging, onto the secondary mast. Most of the connections are via a simple pack and hold, but even then putting them together on camera is difficult because, as I've mentioned many times, I'm doing it at a very weird angle to cater for the video recording process that I have to carry out at a rather weird angle so that I don't block the view of what I'm doing from the camera. So that then is the secondary mast and secondary pirate flag assembled. I believe I've forgotten this tiny rope section which have to be placed in between the flag and the mast. Now this rope will eventually attach to the secondary yard or beam that is holding the secondary sail. So I'm just making sure I got the orientation correct. Even if I didn't, the ropes can move reasonably freely in a 360 degree around the mast, so I can reorient it to the correct position if I need to after putting the two parts of the mast together over the rope. So now let's move on to the secondary sail, which I had partially painted, in that the red stripes that you see on the sail as well as the metallic parts all have been painted, while the beige yellow color is the original plastic molding color. So now just let me look at the instructions just to figure out how am I going to attach the secondary yard or beam onto the sail. Again, it's via a simple pack and hold connection system, but the trick is to get the orientation correct, which I think I'm doing, no, wait, I think I got it the wrong way around. So let's just reorient. I might have gotten it right the first time. Let me try that again. Okay, now things are fitting in much easier. So whenever you encounter problems fitting two pieces together, it's most likely that you got the orientation wrong. So that's the secondary sail fitted onto the secondary yard or beam. The beam that is holding the secondary sail, part of it, especially the ropes and the rigging, have been painted using lacquer paint, while the beam itself have been panelined using enamel paint. So now let's attach the secondary mast onto the secondary sail. I believe the system is slightly different from what you saw on the main sail. I'm just trying to figure out the correct orientation, so bear with me. Yeah, I think I've gotten it right. So now the mast is attached to the sail. Next, I'll be putting the ropes that are on the mast onto the beam that is holding that secondary sail. Although the rope is actually just molded plastic, it looks really lifelike in the sense that it looks like a real rope, especially if you paint it up like I did using enamel paints in my case. So that's the sub-assembly for the secondary sail and mast completed. We'll move on now to assembling the orange trees on the ship. Now, unless I'm mistaken, the orange trees come from the backstory of one of the main characters, which is Nami. She is part of the Captain Luffy's pirate crew, and there's a whole long backstory about Nami and orange trees. And I guess it makes sense to have oranges on the ship. After all, what better than oranges and vitamin C to prevent scurvy? So the orange trees come in 3 separate parts, which I'm attaching together here. For the trees itself, what I did was to paint the green parts with enamel paint, especially the shadow parts. And for the oranges, I've painted it up using acrylic paint. So that's the orange trees assembled. We'll go on to the next steps, which will involve putting these parts or sub-assemblies onto the ship itself. So now we are going to be attaching the secondary sail and secondary mast, as well as the fully assembled orange trees onto the deck of the Going Merry ship. Now this will involve steps 22 and 23, as you can see on the instructions here. Now let's get started on it. First, let me bring the main sub-assembly that I've completed so far, which is the ship itself, back into view. I said this many times, it's really difficult to assemble such a large kit on camera. I find that the positioning of the camera as well as the space that I have to work with has become much smaller. Not only that, but the angle that I'm viewing what I'm doing is kind of from a weird point of view. At least not from the point of view that I'm used to when I'm assembling kits this large. So first, I attach this secondary mast onto the rear deck of the ship. I'm just making sure the connection that I've made is secure, but it doesn't seem to want to go into the hole. No, it's in now. Next, I'll have to attach the ropes from the secondary mast onto the sides of the rear deck. Again, these are done using a simple pack and hole joint connection. I'm struggling here a bit because my view or point of view of what I'm doing is very severely restricted. As I try to do this on camera. On top of that, I'm trying very hard not to break anything that I've assembled so far, which I really hope I'm not going to do. Break the parts on the ship, that is. So now, I'm trying my best to put the rope onto the deck without snapping the rope in half. I think I've gotten the first one in. Just let me be, no, it's not fully in yet. So just pushing it as hard as I can onto the hole. From the tension of the rope, I guess I've succeeded. Let me move on to the other rope on this side of the hull or deck. So that's two in quick succession. Just making sure again that the connection is tight. Being careful not to break anything, I'm going to proceed to the other side of the secondary mast. This will involve the same thing, two similar ropes attached to the other side, the right side of the ship's hull, or to the side of the rear deck. One of the reasons that this pack and hole connection is difficult for me to put together is because I guess they contain a thin layer of primer or paint that kind of causes the fitting to be tighter than usual. Oh no, I think I've just broken the railing yet again. but I'll have to glue that back on together. But let me do that later. Let me just fix the last of the ropes from the secondary mast onto the rear deck. It's kind of frustrating trying to do something so simple, and it's turning out to be harder than I expected. Again, mostly this is because of from the point of view that I'm doing it on camera. So that's the ropes connected to the deck, ropes from the secondary mast. Now for this railing, I'm not going to waste your time. I'm going to glue it back on off camera before coming back to put the orange trees onto the deck. So I had gone ahead to fix the broken railing back onto the ship again. That was the second time that I've broken it, so it has become a weak point of the ship, but at least it's back on now, so I can proceed to place the orange trees onto the small shed on the rear section of the deck of the ship. Now these orange trees are a very unique feature of the Going Merry ship. As I mentioned earlier, the lore behind them revolves around one of the main characters of the One Piece Going Merry ship's pirate crew, in particular Nami. So this is a characteristic that clearly defines and makes this pirate ship very, very unique. Placing them onto the small shed is a fairly simple procedure, which just involves placing a square peg into a square hole. It's made slightly difficult by the fact that it lies between the main and secondary sails, and I'm trying very hard not to break anything, because I have to apply a strong force to ensure that the trees fix onto the shed. So that's the orange trees fully attached onto that small brown shed that you see on the deck. Just let me place the ship back onto the display stand. And with that done, we can now move on to the next steps of the ship, which will involve more riggings or ropes for the ship. Here then, laid out on the work mat, are parts which involve yet more riggings or ropes for the ship. Let us first have a quick look at the instructions to see what is involved. So we are resuming with step 24 as well as step 25 before moving on to step 26 and 27, which involves attaching all those ropes and riggings onto the ship and sail. Now this continues on to step 28, in which the sort of cross-hatch rigging from the crow's nest to the side of the ship. Let's start with the assembly proper of the rigging and ropes onto the ship's deck as well as to its sails. We'll begin with the ropes that come out from the top of the main mast and onto the side of the crow's nest. So I'm just establishing the orientation of the ropes in relation to the mast and the side of the crow's nest. I'll begin by attaching the ropes onto the mast before placing them on the hole connections at the side of the crow's nest. Now, the inclusion of all these ropes and riggings are, in my opinion, essential to give the ship a little bit more realistic look to it. Now, I know this is kind of an oxymoron because, first of all, the Going Merry ship is just an imaginary anime pirate ship. But since we are building a model kit of the ship itself, I think Bandai made a good choice in making sure that the kit, or rather the scale model kit of this ship, looks as if it's a realistic pirate ship. So in this sense, the ropes and riggings play an essential role to increase the realism of the overall look of this Going Merry pirate ship. So now I'm just attaching the other half of the crow's nest rigging. The connections are the same as on the other side. And while I might not sound like it, my nerves are actually on edge because there's this innate fear that I'm going to break something, especially either the ropes that I'm trying to attach from the mast to the crow's nest, or maybe break off the mast from the ship's hull, or even the sail or the flags while I'm doing this. Since the rest of the ship is kind of all over the place, in the sense that I feel as if I'm being surrounded by fragile parts everywhere. For example, the main mast and the secondary mast, as well as the sails and all the trees that are on the main deck of the ship, and the existing rigging and ropes that I've already attached. All this seems to be surrounding the area that I'm working on now. So in a way, my mind is in kind of like a fearful haze, being surrounded by a fear that I'm going to break something eventually. I hope that's not the case. Maybe that's why it seems so difficult for me to get this rigging on the crow's nest in place. And as you can see, I'm not actually finished with the rigging on the crow's nest yet, but I'll come back to it later and give it another try. But for now, I'll just move on to another section of the ship's rigging. This particular rope that I'm holding with my right hand actually links the top of the secondary flag onto the beam that is holding the secondary sail. Again, seem to be moving very slowly with this assembly process of the rigging and the ropes. Is because I have this feeling like I'm going to break something at any moment. So I'm proceeding with the assembly as slowly as I can and not rush it, as I'm tempted to do, so as to not break anything. So then this is the rigging or rope which fixes the top of the secondary flag onto the beam that holds the secondary sail. With that done, let's move on now to let me see which section shall I do next. Let me try fixing the cross hatch rigging. At least I don't think so that's what it's called, but it looks like a cross hatch to me. This particular rigging design actually links the main mast onto the side of the ship. This is a type of rigging that in the movies you would see the sailors or the pirates use it as a sort of pseudo ladder in order to climb all the way to the crow's nest from the deck of the ship. I'm just making sure that I have the connection of this particular rigging to the main mast slightly below. Oh, it just came out. The top of this rigging actually attaches slightly below the crow's nest, but onto the main mast. So let me try this another way. Let me attach it to the side of the ship first. By hooking these 4 connections onto the side of the ship before I attach the top end of this rigging onto the main mast at the location that is just below the crow's nest. That's the pseudo ladder-like rigging on the left side of the ship assembled. I will now proceed with yet another piece of rigging that attaches from the side of the crow's nest onto that pseudo ladder-like rigging. So I presume that this particular piece of rigging actually allows the sailor or pirate to reach the crow's nest. Essentially, he would climb from the deck onto that pseudo ladder-like rigging. Then when he finally reaches that piece that I just attached, it actually enables him to climb all the way right up into the crow's nest. So that's the rigging on the left side of the ship. Let us now attach the rope or rigging which links the secondary sail, the bottom left corner of the secondary sail, onto the rear deck of the Going Merry ship. Now, I apologize, I think this is going off camera. Just let me move it back on camera. So as you can see, I've already attached the rigging onto the secondary sail. So now all I have to do is to fix it onto the rear deck. Now this is difficult to do at the angle in which I'm viewing this, but I'm trying not to rush it because I do not want to break either the rigging or worse still, the secondary sail. So maybe I'll get back to it later, or perhaps even do it off camera. We'll see how it goes and we'll play it by ear. I'll instead proceed with a different section of the ship, which involves this particular rope or rigging that I'm holding on with my right hand, which fixes a rope. So it's very difficult for me to hold this whole ship with one hand while trying to attach the rope with the other. Now the ideal way would be to leave the ship rested carefully onto the display stand so that it's secure. Then I can then attach the rope onto the side of the ship as I'm trying to do now. But unfortunately, I'm trying to get all this on camera, hence I'm now holding the ship with one hand while trying to attach the rope onto the mainsail with the other hand. So it's kind of a balancing work that I'm doing now. Let's see if I can get it into the mainsail. It's not going in. Let me try again. Okay, so that's the left side of the rigging more or less complete, and I'll continue on with the other side of the rigging and ropes around the Going Merry ship. So again, with the magic of video editing, I am now going to proceed almost immediately with the rest of the assembly of the rigging and ropes around the Going Merry ship. In actual fact, I actually had to take a break because my nerves are on edge, having to deal with all this fragile rigging, in addition to trying so hard not to break the rest of the ship. So I just had to take a short 5 to 10 minute break, and now I'm actually coming back to complete the rigging assembly process. Now, with some experience of doing at least more than 50% of the rigging already, I'm hoping that the rest of this process will be much faster. And while I'm doing the assembly for the rest of the rigging, as well as fixing whatever parts of the rigging that might have come loose, I'll just quickly explain in more detail what I had done in terms of painting these riggings. Essentially what I did was to paint the rope using a dark brown enamel paint, but I didn't use a primer before I painted the ropes. While the enamel paint can adhere to the plastic ropes fairly well, but since I didn't top coat the ropes, as you can see if you look closely enough, if I were to rub on the ropes too hard, especially this is what I'm doing to certain sections of the rope as I'm trying to assemble them, the paint can come off. So it would be best if you have the time to either prime the ropes before you apply the enamel paint, or if you do not wish to apply the primer, you can still apply the enamel paint without the primer coat. However, you would still need to top coat it to ensure that the paint does not rub off if you rough handle the rigging or ropes. So now I'm at the stage where I was with the other side of the rigging assembly. This is the part where the rope attaches from the side of the hull, extending from the pseudo ladder rigging onto the mainsail. Indeed, the process of putting together the rigging, the rest of the rigging that is actually much faster once I get used to working with all the rigging and rope parts. So now I'm just tying off loose ends, parts of the rigging which I did not fix properly earlier. For example, this rope that attaches from the corner of the secondary sail onto the rear deck, and this rigging on the crow's nest. Both these I will attempt to fix up now. It seems that the rigging on the crow's nest has come loose during the assembly process for the rest of the rigging. So I'll have to refix the ends of the crow's nest rigging onto the side like so. And let's hope they don't come off again. I'm being extra careful because the last thing I want is to break that main mast in two, which is actually, if you think about it, easy to do since I'm not really anchoring the ship's hull onto the display stand, and the ship is actually moving all over the place. So anyway, that's the rigging for the crow's nest more or less done. I'm just moving on to the last section of the rigging and ropes assembly process, which is to attach the rope from the secondary sail onto the rear deck. Just pressing it in to make sure it's tight. Still not really fixed properly. There, it came out again. Maybe I'll just have to move the secondary sail a bit, or just pushing it in again. Okay, finally in. Just let me have a quick check to see if all the rigging is connected properly. I guess that's okay for now. I most likely will have to revisit them again when I do the rest of the assembly process, because I have a feeling some of them will come loose again eventually, though I hope not. So anyway, that's the assembly process for the rigging and ropes surrounding the Going Merry ship. Just let me rest the ship, the bottom of the ship's hull onto the display stand, and we'll move on to the final section of the assembly process, which is the masthead and the other railings. But before that, let's just have a quick look around at the ship as it stands now, especially how the ship looks overall, with the riggings and ropes attached to either the main or secondary mast, and between the main sails and the sides of the ship, or between the secondary sails and the rear deck. I honestly believe that the riggings and ropes that are assembled here give the Going Merry ship a very realistic look to it overall. For sure, it improves the way the scale model kit looks in terms of an increase in the realism of what you would expect how a pirate ship would look, bearing in mind that this Going Merry ship is actually an imaginary ship from an anime series. So, having had a look at the rigging and ropes around the Going Merry ship, we will now move on to the final part of the assembly process, which is to fix the ship's masthead as well as the rest of its railings. Laid out on the work mat that you see here are the various parts that make up the Going Merry's iconic masthead, as well as the rest of the railings that will surround the hull. The assembly process for these parts will begin in step 29, in which the railings are placed onto the sides of the ship, continuing on steps 30 and 31, which will be the installation of the ship's masthead. So let's get started on this final stage of the Going Merry ship's assembly process. And as I've been doing, first I'll have to bring the ship itself back into view on camera. So I guess I'll start attaching the railings first, specifically the railings on the rear of the ship. I'm just trying to figure out where the attachment is going to be, and it's just a simple slot in which the pegs go into, which I believe will give it a secure enough connection that it doesn't come loose easily. that's the rearmost railing attached onto the ship's deck. Now, these parts are much sturdier and larger than these small railing that I had broken twice already. So now I'm just attaching the railing on the rear left side of the ship. And if you actually look closely enough, there are some gaps visible between the railings, and I guess this is unavoidable because the way I am going about the assembly is to paint, or rather in this case paneline the piece first before putting it onto the ship's deck. I guess one way to really avoid the gaps that show slightly on the railings is to attach everything on, put some putty on the gaps, prime everything, then paint them. But I don't think that's worth the time and effort for the final look that you're going to get. So I'm actually pretty happy with what I'm getting here. Well, the gap on the left side is a bit too big, but I'll see what I can do about it later. So anyway, now I'll just move on to the front railings, right at the front of the ship. The correct terminology, I believe, is the bow of the ship, which refers to the front of the ship, while its rear is known as the ship's stern. So anyway, I'm just finishing up the railings for the bow of the ship. This is the final section for the railings at the front end or the bow of the ship. With that done, we can finally move on to the assembly of the ship's masthead, also on to the front end of the ship. I'm just putting the anchor aside so that the spine of the masthead can be fixed onto the ship's hull. Like so. Now this is the spine on the left side of the bow. So now I'm just doing it, repeating the step that I did on the other side. The spine provides a base onto which the iconic masthead will attach to. So that square pack there, I believe, is where the masthead will eventually attach to. So now let's get started on the masthead. Just putting the ship on its side. Before I put the masthead onto the ship, I'll just assemble the horns for what I believe is the head of a ram. Now the black pupils that you see there, I had painted. Although a sticker was provided, but wherever I can, I will always try to avoid using the sticker decals that the kit provides. Because when push comes to shove, the best looking result would be to paint it or to panel line it rather than sticking a color correcting sticker decal onto the section concerned. So that's the horns for the left side of the ram's head completed. But it seems like my gloves has torn a big hole, especially on my left hand. So let me just get a change of new gloves before I proceed with assembling the horns on the other side of the ram's head. Okay, so I have my new set of gloves on. I will now proceed to put the right horn together and attach it to the right half of the ram's head, like so. This is the right half of the masthead, which is in the shape of a ram's head. Now I notice a gap on the horn at the left half of the head, which is actually non-existent on the other half. So I'm just trying to realign the horn so that the gaps don't show as much. So I'm just comparing it. There's still a little bit of gap showing, but I guess it's good enough. I wouldn't want to waste too much time just trying to align the horn onto the ram's head. Let's attach the left half of the masthead first. Before we complete its assembly by fixing on the right half of the masthead. The fitting is rather tight, so I'm applying a fair bit of force to close up the two halves and close up the gaps that are currently showing on the masthead. So that's the masthead fully assembled and attached onto the Going Merry ship. It's fittingly the last part that is put onto the ship. So the Going Merry pirate ship is finally done. I'm going to put on a quick 360-degree view of the ship so that you can have a look at how it looks fully assembled, with most of its parts either fully painted or at the very least panel line. Let's move on now to have the quick 360-degree view of the ship. This has been a very long drawn out video on the assembly process of the Going Merry ship. Thank you so much for your patience in watching this video and seeing me put together this iconic one-piece ship. Just so that you know, I'll be uploading another video showing detailed close-up views of the Going Merry ship. But for now, I would like to thank you very much for watching this video, and if you liked it, please do like and subscribe to my video. Have a great day. Thanks for watching.